Hello. In this presentation, I will share how using Think-Alouds in my courses has helped cultivate partnerships with students. A quick introduction, my name is Sauerwein. I'm a faculty member at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, which is right outside St. Louis in the Midwestern United States. I am an iSodal member as well as a member of the Advocacy Committee, and my contact information is included on this slide. Although she is not presenting with me today, I wanted to acknowledge my collaborator, Jennifer Thistle. She is a faculty member at Western Washington University. Today, we will talk about Think-Alouds, why you might incorporate them into your courses, how you might incorporate them into your courses, and along the way, I'll share how my collaborator and I have incorporated them into our graduate courses, as well as some of the outcomes of doing so. At the end of the presentation, I will share resources and references for you. So let's get started by thinking about why we might use Think-Alouds in our teaching. For me, the biggest benefit of using Think-Alouds is that they help cultivate partnerships with students. And using Think-Alouds does this in a few ways. First, it helps me uncover bottlenecks to my students' learning. This is consistent with the decoding the disciplines process. In fact, uncovering bottlenecks to students' learning is the first step in this process. And it's important to me as a junior faculty member that I understand where my students struggle in my courses. Many of the courses I'm teaching, I've taught only 2 or 3 times, and it still feels rather fresh and new. And I need to really dig deep and determine where might my students need a little bit more guidance or instruction or feedback. And uncovering bottlenecks helps me to find those areas. Think-Alouds are particularly useful in uncovering bottlenecks. They're not necessarily the only way to do that, but they're great because they make our students' thoughts and learning visible in a way that sometimes other assessment products do not allow us to see students thinking. Another way that Think-Alouds cultivate student partnerships is it shifts the emphasis from faculty instruction to student learning. So in this presentation, I will discuss how making this shift has really helped my students along their path of inquiry and to take ownership over their learning. The outcome and the performance on the students' Think-Alouds really guided subsequent instruction and learning in our courses. So as we continue on, I encourage you to think about what some bottlenecks are in the courses that you teach. I can identify a bottleneck in almost, I feel like, every course that I teach. And so certainly it would be helpful as you listen to this presentation to think about one area where your students might struggle. Maybe you know the bottleneck, or maybe you're interested in finding out the bottleneck. So I encourage you to think about it as I share some methods that we used to incorporate Think-Alouds in our class. So to provide some context, my collaborator and I teach graduate level courses on augmentative and alternative communication. This is an area of practice for speech language pathologists in which the therapists support people who have complex communication needs. These people with communication disorders require technology or other devices or aids in order to communicate. So the students in our courses are speech language pathologists. Typically, they are near or almost ready to go out into their externships. They've had classes and clinical experiences at our university, but it's almost time for them to go out to externships. This is one of the last courses that they take. So the task at hand here is our students are planning for assessment and intervention for an individual with a communication disorder. So all the time in the real world, speech language pathologists are planning for evaluation and for therapy with their clients and patients. So this is truly an authentic task that our students will take on in their future practice as speech language pathologists. Now, if you think about it, planning for assessment and intervention, typically in the college classroom, we assess students' learning by having them write a plan for us. We can evaluate that plan and looking for different concepts and big ideas, but oftentimes, we assess students' learning with a written plan for an assessment or written plan for intervention. That does leave some things to be desired, though. So we have found that incorporating Think-Alouds while students are planning for assessment and intervention has helped us uncover their thoughts along the way that we might have missed if we only asked the students to write a written plan. we've used Think-Alouds as a formative assessment to help us and our students monitor the learning in the classroom and to, again, uncover those bottlenecks and pinpoint areas where we might focus our instruction. So to give you some specific ideas of how we incorporated Think-Alouds into our courses, in the first semester, we used group Think-Alouds. We had students in groups of 2 or 3, and we presented them with a case. So we described a client or a patient with a communication disorder. Students had the choice of whether they could use an adult case or a child case based on their interest in therapy. And so we gave them the case, and they simply recorded themselves and thought aloud as they planned for assessment. Later on in the semester, we repeated a Think Aloud task, but this time it was for therapy. So again, we gave students a written case, and then they pressed record and they recorded themselves as they planned for therapy with that client. Now, prior to the Think-Alouds, the instructor did model this task because it's not something that we do every day. It was useful for our students to be able to see us model these tasks. Then the students did the Think-Alouds, and after everyone was finished, the instructors, we reviewed the Think-Aloud recordings and then provided feedback to the large group. So as a whole class, we discussed sort of the strengths and areas where we might need to focus more of our instruction. Now, the second semester that we incorporated Think-Alouds, we tried individual Think-Alouds this time. And this helped us pinpoint more individual student differences in their learning. The con here was that it perhaps took more time to review those recordings, but we did get a better understanding of individual students' learning. So similarly, we gave these individual students a case. They thought aloud as they planned for assessment and recorded themselves. Later in the semester, students individually completed a Think-Aloud related to therapy. Again, I modeled the Think-Aloud task for them before they started, and afterwards I provided feedback to the large group. What was different this semester, the second semester, is that we added a peer feedback component where students completed their assessment Think-Aloud, and then afterwards they reviewed a peer or classmate's Think-Aloud. So this gave them the experience of completing the Think-Aloud on their own and also reviewing a peer's in order to think about how the peer's response was similar or different to their own. That semester, we also added reflections where after the intervention Think-Aloud, students reflected on their learning by identifying which areas they felt particularly confident, which areas they were uncertain about or were more of a struggle. And then students also identified areas that they wanted to learn more. So let's discuss some of the results. So I will be honest, I was very impressed with my students' reflections on their learning. Many of the areas that they thought they knew well, or areas that they wanted to learn more about, and perhaps were more of those bottlenecks or difficulty areas, we agreed on those. So the students really did a nice job in planning. So these data are all for planning for intervention. So the students in semester 2, when planning for therapy, did an excellent job describing how they would collaborate with other professionals, treatment approaches that they would use, which they've learned in their other classes in our curriculum. And students also did an excellent job describing the activities they would engage their client in, as well as the materials they would bring with them to the session. So the students identified these areas, they were common themes, and I agreed with those. Students were uncertain about or wanted to learn more about therapeutic strategies, which again, they've learned in other classes and learned in the clinic, but applying those strategies to clients who use augmentative and alternative communication was an area they felt a little less comfortable with. Many students also wanted to learn more about and struggled to describe how they would collect data in the therapy session. And also many students described that they wanted to incorporate family education into their therapy plan, but that they weren't quite sure how to do that. These were common themes in the students' reflection responses, and I agreed with those as the instructor as I reviewed all of the Think-Alouds. I would also add the two final bullet points on this slide. I also did not see many students incorporate literacy into their therapy planning, which is something we had talked about in class, but it appeared that students didn't quite make that connection or understand how to incorporate literacy into their language therapy. And in particular, the final bullet point in italics there, applying conceptual frameworks we had used in the class was particularly challenging for the students. So the students uncovered some bottlenecks, and I agreed with many of those and then added a few as well with the plus signs next to them. I also wanted to share some data about the students' perceptions of completing the Think Aloud task. The majority of students enjoyed completing the Think Aloud. There were a few who were kind of on the fence about it and neutral, and then some students did not enjoy completing it. This makes sense to me as an instructor, as completing a Think Aloud can be a pretty uncomfortable task if you're not used to it. But I was happy to see that 9 out of 17 students agreed that they enjoyed completing it. The data on the second half of the slide was especially promising. The majority of the students recognized that maybe if they didn't even enjoy it, that completing the Think Aloud was an effective way for them to convey their knowledge. And in particular, even if they were uncomfortable, even if they weren't sure if it was the best way for them to convey their knowledge, 16 out of 17 students agreed that completing that Think Aloud really supported their learning. And that to me, as the instructor, was such a wonderful data point to see. In addition, some qualitative data I'd like to share with you here. This is what it's all about. This for me is why incorporating Think-Alouds is so powerful. One student said, the Think-Alouds helped me realize when I didn't know the information. Rather than just sort of submit a written plan and hope that they get a good grade on it, these students were able to stop after the Think Aloud and reflect on where they needed to improve their learning and how I might, as the faculty member, support that learning. And the final data point is just my favorite. The student said, I liked being assessed in more ways than just tests in this class. Using the Think-Alouds and reflections allowed us the chance to talk about what we have learned in a way that felt we would not be penalized for not knowing the answer. This to me is the crux of our students as partnerships purpose, is having our students feel supported and comfortable in that uncomfortable space of learning. It was so powerful to me to see that the students not only enjoyed the Think-Alouds, but that they were very helpful in identifying areas they wanted to improve their learning. So my reflections on using Think-Alouds, really the students' performance on the Think-Alouds shaped my subsequent teaching and our learning together. Really, it was useful in uncovering bottlenecks. I found areas that I'm not sure I would have seen if I had asked the students to submit written plans. Those areas that students were uncertain about became very clear as I reviewed those Think-Aloud recordings. Also, subsequently, after the Think-Alouds, we spent a whole portion of a class talking about data collection. We spent a whole portion of a class discussing how they could apply conceptual frameworks we had learned in the class. And this was so important for me because it shifted the emphasis from me as the faculty member determining what my students needed to learn to really tackling head on the topics that were challenging for them that they had identified. And that really was a powerful experience for both my students and for me. So in some considerations in incorporating Think-Alouds into your courses, you might consider whether you want to incorporate them in groups or in individuals. I will say that having the students complete these individually was particularly helpful in identifying strengths and weaknesses in individual students. The groups was more useful in being efficient, right? We had fewer recordings to review, but we kind of missed some information about some of the students in those groups, as some students were perhaps more engaged or talkative and others were quiet. It was more difficult to assess their learning. Reviewing the recordings can be particularly time consuming, but we did find that using peer feedback was especially helpful and giving the students another opportunity to think about what a response to that challenge might look like. And finally, I recommend using reflections as they were a particularly powerful way for students to guide their inquiry and to reflect on their learning. At the end of this slide here, I have just 3 references for you that I've used throughout this presentation. I have them grouped in 3 areas. These are particularly great resources if you're interested in learning more about students as partners generally, the Decoding the Disciplines process, which I referred to, and also Think-Alouds. This chapter about Think-Alouds is particularly helpful. I've also identified resources for you in each of these areas that are all web links. Each of these have resource lists that will link you to more information that you can learn about these topics. I hope you consider incorporating Think-Alouds into your courses. Thank you very much for your time.